looking back at Bakke. The Supreme Court decided that Alan Bakke was discriminated against because he is white. Has that spelled an end to affirmative action? No. Studs Terkel wrote a book called Working, quoting working people. Working people sometimes use four-letter words, which has led to a situation Chris Kelly will describe this morning.
While the current federal deficit has been growing, a movement has been growing in the United States to prevent future deficits. 31 states have passed resolutions calling for a constitutional convention to consider an amendment that would require a balanced federal budget. It takes 34 states to call a constitutional convention. One of the leaders of the drive for a balanced budget amendment is George Snyder, the president of the National Taxpayers Union, and Mr. Snyder is here now with Jane Bryant Quinn. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Mr. Snyder, I think I recall that during the campaign, candidate Reagan gave at least glancing endorsement to the amendment. What do you think happened?
Well, I think that the president supports the amendment, as he said during the campaign, but I think it's a question of political considerations of first things first. And one of the things that happens, presidents year after year, in fact for the last 24 years, have claimed they're going to balance the budget, but they're never ever able to do so. I think it happened once perhaps in the last 24 years, and that was just a very small budget balancing act. Political considerations become more expedient at the time. This seems like it's something that's off forever and ever, but I can assure you it's not.
Mr. Snyder, you're just 3 states short now of getting your balanced budget or your constitutional convention called. Do you have any limit on when you have to get these 3 states?
No. The limit would come in at the ratification process. The Constitution under Article 5 provides 2 methods in which to amend the Constitution. One is by Congress drafting the amendment and sending back to the states for ratification. The other way is the route that's the most difficult, and the one that we chose, which is to get 2/3 of the states, or 34 state legislatures, to say to Congress, in effect, you draft the amendment, and if you fail to do so, there shall be a constitutional convention for the single and sole purpose of drafting said amendment.
Well, your movement has been slowing down recently, has it not? You just got Alaska, but that was the first one we had.
It's picking up when we get number 31, and just a couple weeks ago, as you said.
You haven't had one in 2 years before Alaska.
That's right. We went 2 years with a rather difficult situation. Actually, 2 things existed. One, a new president that naturally was talking austerity, trying to bring the country around under a fiscal program, who said, in effect, I think I can accomplish this. State legislators were saying, in effect, give the president a chance. They know now that the special interest pressures on members of Congress is still there, and that the only route left is really a constitutional amendment to make this happen.
Well, we're facing something like a $100 billion deficit this year. What if the constitutional amendment were in effect right now? What would happen?
Well, let's put it in a proper perspective to begin with. You know, let's say we had 34 states today, Congress obviously would get down to the business of drafting the amendment. The same thing they did with the direct election of U.S. senators. When the pressure is heavy, they finally get to the job. You know, the American people have shown over 80% of them want this particular issue.
But what if they drafted the amendment and it's passed? What would Congress do faced with a $100 billion deficit? What is their rule?
No, the point I'd like to make is this. It would take 3 years to go through almost the procedure of ratification and to get the House in order, so to speak. And I think what you would have happen in this country, instead of a congressman going around with, in effect, with a credit card that he never has to redeem or never have to come to a day of reckoning. It's like giving every member of Congress a Visa, Master, or American Express card and saying, go to it. The whole attitude would change. The congressman would say, as they do in 47 out of the 50 states, as you do in your household, as we do in our business, hey, we got to balance our budget. There'd be a whole different attitude. And they say to the constituent, you know what, we've got to take first things first, and we have to prioritize.
But Mr. Snyder, you said before we went on the air that you were a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. You thought he did what he had to do. Could he have done it if he didn't have some deficits? He had to run up some deficits.
Yes, but look at the small deficits then compared to what we've had in the last few years.
We're talking about a very serious problem of $107 billion that goes to the cost of interest alone. Just think of this, all these things that we want for programs. The 3rd biggest item in the federal budget goes to the cost of that money.
The critics of the balanced budget amendment, while wanting a balanced budget, which everyone always says they do, says the problem is people say, let's balance the budget, but then when you say, what do you cut, your organization pulls back and says, hey, that's not my problem. And when you're talking about 100 billion deficits, you're talking about having to cut defense or Social Security. People don't want to do that.
Well, here's what's happened. Special interest groups go to congressmen one after another and try to get their thing, get their piece of the action. And what happens, the taxpayer doesn't really get an opportunity to see the total requests, the total pressures. And what a balanced budget would do is require them to sit down and present a statement each year. The exciting thing to us is the fact that the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee has passed out of committee a very fine balanced budget resolution that also limits taxes and can bring about this very thing I talk about, an opportunity to talk about priorities in this country without, it's sort of like we're in a situation where we have a major wound and we're constantly trying to put Band-Aids on it. First things first.
Would you be in favor of balancing the budget if it meant raising taxes?
If it's absolutely necessary to do so to meet needs, of course.
So the balanced budget is the key thing, even if taxes went up. But this is not what Republicans want to vote for right now.
We're talking about interest rates being high because of it. We're talking about productivity being much better and jobs being available. I mean, we've got to come to grips with this serious problem. And I think the thing that's so scary, since this movement started, we've increased our deficits by over $300 billion. And if you take the deficits and tie it to the inflation rate, in 1965 to 1978, the deficits were about $2 billion a year, and the inflation rate was about 2%. Now, look at it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Snyder. I think the polls do show that the public favors a balanced budget.
Thank you, Jane. And Charles and I will be back with more news in just a minute.
It's now 18 minutes after the hour.
Since tuna comes in cans, you can't see the difference between good tuna and great tuna. But what if some cans were clear?
Good morning. This is today, Thursday, April 1st. Yes, April Fool's Day. And in the Courthouse Plaza in Fresno, California, that statue stands in recognition of the many Armenians who helped settle the rich farmlands of the San Joaquin Valley. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Wallace, here along with the whole Today Show crew.
Everybody.
Jane Pauley, Gene Shalit, Willard Scott, except for Brian Gumbel, who is on vacation. He'll be back on Monday.
That's correct.
Our top news story at this hour, avalanches in Northern California have killed 3 people, and Jane will have that story in just a moment. Also in this half hour, consumer reporter Kathleen O'Reilly wraps up her series on women's work and how efforts to make the workplace safer for women pays off in greater productivity.
Chris, there's been a rather quiet move underway to convene another constitutional convention in this country to make balanced federal budgets mandatory, and it is suddenly very close to passage. Some people who oppose it not only oppose it, they call it dangerous. Phil Donahue will listen to both sides of that argument in this half hour.
And guess who will be with us in this hour? You're right. Brother Dominic from the Xerox commercials. Bless him.
But first, the news of the morning. Avalanches, as Chris said. At least 3 people were killed and 7 are missing after an avalanche hit a ski lodge in Squaw Valley, California. Frank Burkholzer has the details.
There was a warm spell at Lake Tahoe 2 weeks ago, and then last Sunday the spring snows began. Storm after storm, piling the wet snow higher and higher on the unstable base. Avalanche warnings were issued, and yesterday the avalanches began. At Squaw Valley, 2 cabins were struck by snowslides. 5 persons in those cabins escaped uninjured. But at Alpine Meadows, where luckily there were very few tourists, a very large avalanche brought death and destruction. Patrick Kemp described what he saw.
The beaver bowl slipped and covered the whole lodge, and there were employees and a few people who had gone up to maybe wait out the storm to see if they could ski, and were digging out their cars, and that's when it hit, and some made it out, some didn't.
When darkness fell, the search for victims was halted because of the danger of further avalanches. But rescue workers were prepared to return to the scene today and search for more possible victims. And the snow continued. Frank Burkholzer, NBC News at Lake Tahoe.
In New York City, opening arguments will be heard today in the trial of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. He is accused of failing to report $150,000 in income during the 1970s. Moon says the money belonged to his church and was tax exempt. Questions have been raised about the training exercise in which 4 Army paratroopers died in California. Meredith Lewis reports.
A partial autopsy suggested all 4 paratroopers were dragged to death along the ground by their parachutes. The report contradicts the Army statement that only 1 man died from dragging and backs up what the injured paratroopers had said, that the winds were very strong when they were ordered to jump. First Lieutenant Robert Breitmeyer was identified as one of the dead. He was 27. The lieutenant's father wants to know more details.
I do feel a little strongly about this, that if there was some grave mistake made, that it surely should be corrected.
Meanwhile, Army investigators now believe that the drop zones where 4 paratroopers died were hit by freak gusts of wind that no one could anticipate. Paratroopers who saw their friends killed or injured were still bitter.
I figure there's no way you should jump into a field training exercise like this under high winds. Wait till you go into the real combat and jump then, and you know what you're going into. There's no reason to lose anybody out here at all.
Despite the accidents, morale among the soldiers remains good, according to Major Thomas Smith.
These are paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division. If you can find better soldiers somewhere, you let me know.
The 82nd dug in and set up defensive positions for today's maneuvers. They will be attacked and outnumbered by another unit, imitating tactics used by the Soviet Army. Meredith Lewis, NBC News, Fort Irwin, California.
President Reagan has rejected the idea of a freeze on nuclear arms production. In his first primetime news conference, Mr. Reagan said a freeze would be dangerous because the Russians have what he called a definite margin of superiority over the U.S. But he held out the hope that negotiations with the Soviet Union could lead to a reduction in weapons. Earlier on today, Senator Edward Kennedy disputed the Reagan contention that the Soviets are in a superior position. The Iranian news agency says Ayatollah Khomeini today granted pardons to 5,000 people convicted by revolutionary courts, and that he commuted the sentences of another 7,000. The action marked the 3rd anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. The Supreme Court has reinstated the murder conviction of Dr. Jeffrey McDonald, a one-time Green Beret found guilty of killing his wife and children. Carl Stern has that story.
Dr. McDonald was convicted in 1979, 9 years after the murder of his wife and children, and 9 years after the Army decided the evidence was insufficient against the former Green Beret captain. But his dead wife's mother and stepfather kept up the pressure for a trial, and 9 years after the event, McDonald says he could no longer establish that drug-crazy hippies killed his family.
You are not able to find witnesses, get proper statements, recollections have changed, been dimmed by memory. Cross-examination becomes very difficult because all we're cross-examining are old notes taken by someone else. It's impossible to defend yourself under those circumstances.
Nonetheless, the Supreme Court ruled that McDonald's right to a speedy trial had not been violated, since most of the time there were no formal charges against him. He was ordered to begin serving a minimum 15 years in prison.
Of course, there will be another appeal, I'm quite sure, because as long as there's money to appeal, one can always find something to appeal about.
McDonald was taken to this prison at Terminal Island, California. His lawyer said they would seek his release while appeals go forward on other grounds. Carl Stern, NBC News, Washington.
We are back at 8:07, and Willard, don't move.
No.
You have something on your lapel.
The entire
Be very careful.
That's right. It was down here a minute ago, and I think it's moving all the way north. It's Scottsdale, Arizona, one of my favorite towns. 5th graders out there in the elementary school are having a health fair all today, and they sent me this little mum. Isn't he cute? Got a little mustache. Looks like Gene Shalit if it had hair. If I had hair, I'd be at CBS. Let's check and see what's happening over there. We have, not over there, over here in the weather map, we have some goodies this morning. Temperatures in the 80s, and as a matter of fact, creeping up towards 100 degrees in West Texas today. That is a bit warm. In other words, a touch of summertime, but that is in contrast to a real honest-to-goodness blizzard situation in the mountains of Northern California, the Lake Tahoe area of California, Nevada. Winter storm watches as far south as the mountains of Northern Arizona. This whole area getting snow today, and maybe even more snow tomorrow. Some of the higher elevations got as much as 2 feet in the last 2 days. Showers in the northwest, rain all the way down to southern California. Thunderstorms in the central plains, rain in the northern plains, mostly sunny throughout the southern tier of states, but afternoon thunder showers a good possibility. Sunny, pleasant, delightful, a warming trend everywhere east of the Mississippi. A few snowflakes disappearing in northern Maine today. Here's what's happening in your part of the country this morning.
Good morning. This is Wendy Ross with Newswatch 8 weather. Partly cloudy through Friday with highs this afternoon in the low to mid 80s, lows tonight in the low to mid 60s.
And Aunt Bessie Emig of Chattanooga, Tennessee is 100 years old today. We got almost that many cards wishing her a happy birthday. Here's Jane.
In a moment, danger lurks on the assembly line. But first, this is Today on NBC.
Yeah, let's go see what it is. Wow, this must be Cypress Garden. Look, Southern Crossroads.
Having fun, boys?
Who is that guy? Gosh, I never knew Cypress Gardens is so big and so much fun.
Frankly, boys, it's the most fun you'll have in Florida.
She knows what she can handle. From cut of the head to sexy sandals, attitude, confidence. She's got Connie, confidence. Looks so good. So very good.
And the time now is 8:16. A constitutional convention to mandate a balanced budget? Well, not everyone thinks that's a good idea. Here's Phil Donahue in Chicago.
Should your Constitution be amended to say that you can't spend more than you take in? Yes, say a lot of people, including a number of people who are holding elective offices in various states in this country. Here on two sides of that issue are, on the right, Fred Wertheimer, president of Common Cause in Washington, D.C. On your left is George Snyder, president of the National Taxpayers Union in Washington, D.C. Mr. Snyder would like to see a constitutional amendment which says you can't spend more than you take in. Now, let me take you to school here in a little civics lesson and jump in here, gentlemen. Help me out. What you see here is a map of the United States which will essentially show you those states which have passed in their own legislatures, in both houses, a call for Congress to convene a constitutional convention. As you can see, a total of 31 states, all those in orange, in effect, have elected representatives in their own state capitals who've said, yes, we want a constitutional convention at which a constitutional amendment calling for a balanced budget may be considered. Those that are in blue are states in which it is at least 50% through the legislative process. That is to say, one house in these states has passed it. These are the states, then, that have already, Ohio, Washington, Missouri, and Kentucky. If either of those, if three of those four states commit the second part of their legislature to this action, then is Congress obliged to call for a constitutional convention?
Well, I think so. I think one of the great dangers with this movement is the idea of a constitutional convention. We've had one in this country back in 1787.
And that's what wrote the Constitution.
It created the charter for the nation. If we want to create a new charter for the nation, then we should go into that frontally. But one of the real fears and dangers here is that we can do it backwards, because no one knows what happens once you call that constitutional convention. You can get, there are 150 different constitutional amendments.
Well, I couldn't disagree with you more. I think we have to put this in the proper perspective. The Constitution provides two ways in which to prepare amendments. It says first the Congress can draft amendment upon 2/3 votes of members of the Congress.
Yeah, then 38 states.
And 38 states to ratify.
All right, you got the amendment.
That's right.
All right. Now we're going the other way now with this.
That's right. But the states don't meet regularly like the Congress.
Yes.
So they had to create the vehicle by which, when 2/3 of the states call for a convention on a particular issue, such as an issue of dealing with the balanced budget,
yes,
there shall be a single-purpose convention.
Okay, but we have no way of knowing whether such a convention would be limited to one issue, and that's the danger. We haven't done this for 200 years.
Well, the reason why we haven't done it is a very simple reason, is Congress has blocked the states from doing it. because it also must provide the procedures for the convention.
Right.
And Congress has failed to do that.
But if I'm understanding Mr. Wertheimer's misgiving, he's saying that once you get a constitutional convention, you're going to have the abortion advocates, anti-abortion, you're going to want people prayer in school, amendment, you're going to want
freedom of speeches, and freedom of the press.
And also, yes, sir, you can cancel certain...
well, no, let's just talk about that for a second. You can open Pandora's box with the convention.
That's his point.
Theory. Okay, you can open Pandora's box. But first, let me say that 90% of the authorities in this country and the scholars believe that you can limit it to a single purpose. Whether the Congress prepares the amendment or the convention prepares the amendment.
Right.
38 states aren't going to ratify Pandora's box, my friend.
Well, but we don't know where we're headed. So we should look at the question of why are we trying to get there, which takes you to the issue of is a constitutional amendment on the balanced budget of sufficient importance to potentially open up Pandora's box?
Many people who are using the convention cause as the excuse are the biggest deficit spender causers in the history of this country.
Let us show the amendment that you're proposing. If there were to be an amendment, here is suggested wording. Prior to each fiscal year, the Congress shall adopt a statement of receipts and outlays for that year in which total outlays are no greater than total receipts. Sounds like somebody talking to his kid going away to college. No. Don't go over what you have in the checkbook. What's so bad about that?
Well, it's a wonderful, powerful idea. It implies there's a magic, simple solution to our economic problems, and there isn't. And the best example of that is the fact that the President of the United States has been one of the strongest, longest supporters of a balanced budget.
And
he becomes President of the United States, faces realities, and proposes a large deficit for 82, 83, 84.
Come on, let's get down to the basic problem. The basic problem, all we hear and read about each and every day, deals with inflation, deals with jobs, deals with high interest rates.
Okay, but suppose...
I think what we have to recognize here, this debt is $1 trillion. The interest on the debt is over $100 billion a year, the third biggest item in the budget.
No,
let's get to the big problems of jobs, inflation, and interest.
There's
and
no
start talking about these
solution.
things.
I go back.
Oh, that's a cop-out.
No
that's a cop-out.
Greater supporter of a balanced budget for his whole career than the President of the United States. Becomes president, and he finds he's got to come forward
Fred,
with
let me tell you what's going to happen.
$100 billion deficit.
Common cause is known for accountability in government. And we will be able to change the political system in this country where public officials will not get reelected upon how much they can give to people that want this and want that, but they'll stand up and be accountable for the expenditures. You're going to have a whole era of truth and spending.
You can't manage the economy through the United States Constitution.
No, the practical politics are a member of Congress is finally going to get the message when they have to, because they aren't going to let someone run for a constitutional convention who ultimately can become popular.
So in the practical, real world, you're saying there probably will be no con-con, as we call it.
Yeah, and I have no fear if there is. But practically, I don't think it'll happen.
Well, we don't know that. This is dangerous brinksmanship. It's kind of like playing in a very dry forest with lighted matches, because once 34 states do pass it, we're in Never Never Land. We're into uncertainty. And one of the things we may well face is we're off to a constitutional convention.
Countries fall economically before they do militarily or politically. And to sit here and try to be very academic when people are out of work, when interest rates are high because of the fact that the government's sucking up all the borrowed money, let's get down to basics.
But if you changed all these, if you got all these states to do this, and it's a ploy, isn't this an enormous waste of time on already overworked state legislatures that have more to do than ploys?
It's a tremendous dedicated effort over a period of 8 years by people who are concerned about the future of this country. I don't feel comfortable leaving $1 trillion debt to the unborn.
For the record, this issue, which has already been approved, the amendment idea has been approved by the Senate Judiciary Committee, as you suggested. It is speculated that this will be considered by the entire Senate, perhaps as early as the month of April. For now, with thanks to you both, this is Phil Donahue for the Today Show in Chicago. Now back to New York.
You know, the idea of a constitutional convention is fascinating. I saw a poll once where they asked people how you would vote on various amendments, various parts of the Bill of Rights, without telling them it was part of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, right to bear arms, and there were a lot of people who voted against those things. I'll tell you one thing, though, if there's a constitutional convention, I want to be a floor reporter.
And now, Chris, they're taking on the All-American Cheeseburger. We'll be talking about that in the next half hour, too, but it's time for a station break.
Repulsive, did you say?
Yeah.